Welcome to this voyage through one of the most unsettling tales to ever come out of Appalachia's hidden depths. This story will impact you in unexpected ways, so leave a comment from where you are currently watching. This film was made entirely for amusement and is a work of fiction. Any similarity to real people, living or deceased, is entirely coincidental. Imagine a remote valley in the West Virginia highlands where the solitude is so heavy and mist floats between old pine trees. Your shoulders. A geologist made the decision to record the rock formations in this essentially uncharted area in 1902. Edmund Whitmore was a middle-aged man who was fixated on collecting every cave and fissure in the ground that might hold mysteries about the past of geology. He had ventured into that uncharted territory, leaving behind his cozy existence in Pittsburgh. Locals referred to the area as the Valley of Oblivion, a place equipped only with kerosene lights, leather notebooks, and an almost reckless curiosity. Moniker that was more truthful than poetic. Not many folks went there. One incorrect step may result in a tragic fall on the perilous pathways that wound between ravines. However, Edmund had little concern about security or comfort. He aspired to achieve more, something that would establish his reputation in the history of science. And he found the entrance to a cave that wasn't marked on any map because of this exact goal. The opening of the cave, partially obscured by dense vegetation, opened like a wound in the cliff. Boulders and bushes that appeared to have been planted purposefully to deter tourists. As he got closer, Edmund felt a shiver go down his spine. There was more than just a sharp drop in temperature. His rational mind attempted to dismiss the more visceral feeling, but instinct cried out for him to go back. He switched on his flashlight and disregarded the whispered warning. Due to the limited initial few meters, he had to bend between wet, continuously pouring stones. Walls. As if the cave itself were breathing, the sound of his boots hitting the uneven floor produced an unsettling rhythm. Edmund took careful notes, estimating the passage's widths and gathering samples of minerals that glistened dimly in the flashlight's fluctuating light. However, the adventure took an entirely unexpected turn when he arrived at the first chamber. The room was enormous, with a ceiling that vanished into the night sky. The floor was covered with stalactites that dangled like accusing fingers, covered in a thin layer of what Edmund thought was dust at first. He recognized it was ash as he knelt to look at it more closely. Ash from something that had burned, neither volcanic ash or the product of natural erosion. And there were marks that were obviously not the product of nature, carved into the walls with unsettling accuracy. Every possible inch of the stone was covered in hundreds, if not thousands, of symbols. Some resembled Edmund's shapes, while others were organic and geometric. Couldn't identify, but it made him feel quite uneasy. He drew those symbols in his notepad for hours on end, his hands shaking not from the cold but from a mixture of fear and exhilaration. He knew no native peoples who created this. The method, the accuracy, and even the selection of that isolated spot hinted at something distinct, something purposefully concealed. Edmund discovered that the inscriptions on the camera appeared to convey a narrative when he investigated it. They moved in patterns from one wall to another that indicated temporal progression of the story. One symbol predominated above all others in the middle of the greatest wall, a complicated spiral that appeared to go further into the rock, as though it had been burned there with unimaginable ferocity. Edmund felt a peculiar vibration, almost imperceptible, rise up his arm as he touched that mark. He flinched out of instinct. At that moment, he realized the passage was a smaller hole, even narrower than the initial entry, concealed behind a formation of stalagmites. The air is approaching. It was different from there, with a metallic odor that caused his eyes to burn. Edmund was aware that he ought to pause there, record his findings, and then return with a group. However, he felt a magnetic pull from the passage, as though something on the other side was calling his name at frequencies that only his soul could hear. Leaving the first chamber's relative safety behind, he squeezed through the aperture. Edmund had to cling to the rock ledges to keep himself from slipping as the tunnel sank at a sharp angle. His perception was manipulated by the flickering shadows cast by the flashlight's frantic swaying. He was positive he had seen movement ahead on several occasions, shapes that disappeared as soon as the light touched them. With every meter, his breathing became more challenging, not because he was running out of oxygen, but rather because of an increasing pressure in his chest that made it feel like the mountain was closing in on him. Edmund discovered something at the end of the tunnel that went against everything he knew about science. A second, smaller chamber, compared to the first but far more unsettling. There were no symbols on these walls. They were too flawless, polished to a degree that nature could never attain. Additionally, there was a structure in the exact middle of the space that caused Edmund to doubt his own sanity. The building was a dark stone column that appeared to absorb rather than reflect the flashlight's light. Edmund circled the monolith warily, attempting to figure out where it came from. There were no tool marks or signs of how it had been moved or molded. The stone just appeared, as though it had grown out of the cave floor. In contrast to the damp chill of the surroundings, its surface pulsed with a faint heat that seemed oddly warm to the touch. Edmund saw that the floor had been dug out in a perfect circle around the column's base. There were things in this round hollow that made his heart race. Ancient implements, some made of tarnished metal that he was unable to identify, others of petrified wood that alluded to an unattainable age. Additionally, there were pottery jars with designs that repeated the symbols of the preceding room, as well as pieces of fabric that broke at the slightest touch. The manuscripts, which were wrapped in what appeared to be leather but had a texture unlike any animal Edmund was familiar with, were what drew his attention the most. They had pages and pages of thick writing. After what must have been decades, the ink had strangely withstood the test of time, staying black and readable. Centuries of disregard. With shaking hands, Edmund picked up one of the documents and started studying it. He could occasionally decipher portions of the weird mixture of language, which was somewhat Old Latin and partially unfamiliar to him. He was completely chilled by what he was able to translate. In 1847, a group fled persecution, which the manuscripts portrayed in hazy but horrific words, and sought safety in the mountains, according to the book. They weren't your typical people, but a covert group that engaged in what they referred to as profound science, knowledge that combined natural observation with practices that were deemed heretical by the culture of the time. They had selected the cave to serve as both a laboratory and a haven where they could carry out their research without fear of criticism. Edmund read about tests involving rare minerals that were thought to have transforming qualities and were located in that particular Appalachian region. Distillation was explained in the documents. Procedures, elemental combinations that resulted in luminous reactions, and observations on how specific stones appear to react to human presence. The interior structure of the mountain was depicted in intricate graphics that mapped veins of unidentified minerals and even deeper chambers that Edmund had not yet found. The final passage in the papers that the scientist was able to read, however, was what really worried him. The tone of the text changed, becoming increasingly desperate. The words were written carelessly as though the author was rushing, or under a lot of emotional strain. They talked about things they had unearthed from the depths of the earth and discoveries that had exceeded their expectations. Although Edmund couldn't fully understand the descriptions, the author made sure that one phrase would be understood by anyone who would later locate those documents by repeating it multiple times on the last pages in various languages. It was a terrifyingly simple phrase. "Don't descend any lower." A shiver went through Edmund's whole body. He finally saw what his mind had been unable to comprehend up until that point when he gazed past the black stone column. Another aperture, an uneven hole that descended at a nearly vertical angle, was located in the chamber's opposite wall. The air that came out of it was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It smelled horribly wrong, almost like the decaying smell of time itself, but not particularly unpleasant. Edmund's interest in science conflicted with his. Instinct for survival. Every logical part of him cried out for him to record what he had discovered and get out of there right away. However, the part of him that had always yearned for the unknown, which had prompted him to give up a stable job in order to travel to uncharted territory, whispered that the real discovery was farther down. The texts merely served as an introduction. In the depths was whatever that covert outfit had discovered. He walked over to the hole and tossed a stone inside. It took too long for the stone to touch the bottom, to come back, indicating a several-meter drop. Edmund tested the strength of his climbing rope by tying it to a solid ledge. The rope was sturdy. It had descended without any issues in other caves. However, he had a gut feeling that this one would be unique. There was a sense of finality in the air, as though something basic would change and be irreversibly altered by passing that threshold. Edmund started down with his notepad securely stored in his rucksack and his flashlight fastened to his belt. The pit's wall had few places of support and was very smooth. With hands that were starting to burn from the friction, he let himself to slowly slip down the rope. Only pieces of rock face flew by his field of view as his flashlight's light barely broke through the blackness below. The fever increased as he lowered himself farther. His skin tingled with the dry, almost feverish heat, instead of the humid heat of deep tunnels he was familiar with. Edmund started to hear noises he couldn't make out, warped echoes that may be water flowing or something else entirely. His mind started playing games, making patterns out of the cacophonous sounds, turning seemingly insignificant sounds into whispers that seemed to be coming from deep within. It took Edmund a few moments to restore his balance after his feet finally struck firm ground. He had never seen a chamber like the one he had entered. A natural dome was formed by the ceiling's arch, and his flashlight was not the source of the soft, greenish illumination that filled the walls. Thousands of crystals, like frozen stars, were embedded throughout the rock. The weak but steady illumination they gave out created a dreamy environment that made Edmund wonder if he was still conscious. Fascinated by the patterns the crystals created, he moved carefully through the room. They weren't random, he was startled to discover. They trailed particular lines that converged in the room's center, where his attention was entirely captured by something. An artistically precise stone table encircled by benches made of living rock. Items on the table were thoughtfully placed as though someone had just departed and was about to return. There were glass vessels filled with liquids that defied preservation logic by maintaining their vivid colors. There were devices that appeared to be scientific instruments, but Edmund couldn't fathom their uses. Additionally, there were more manuscripts that were in better shape, compared to the earlier ones, with diagrams that appeared to jump off the pages due to their level of detail. Edmund drew his torch closer and started to examine those documents with the fervor of someone who is aware that he is up against something amazing. According to the writings, the team had carried out significantly more research than Edmund had anticipated. They had found that the crystals in that particular room responded to human presence by releasing frequencies that altered how time and space were perceived. The manuscripts that were described, experiments in which participants reported seeing far-off locations and future time frames while meditating for hours in front of the crystals. Some said they saw the mountain's gradual degradation over thousands of years, and so saw the mountain's destiny. However, a developing issue was noted in the texts. The longer they were under the crystal's influence, the harder it was for them to tell the difference between vision and reality. Group members started to report inconsistent experiences, each perceiving various pasts and futures. The nature of what they were seeing was a topic of discussion. Were they hallucinations brought on by a chemical characteristic of the crystals, or were they real views of other realities? With a mixture of rising excitement and scientific skepticism, Edmund took in every word. A part of him wanted to write it off as the rants of folks who had been alone for too long. However, another area, the area that had experienced an odd sensation ever since going into that cave, identified veracity in those stories. The first chamber's sign had vibrated, giving him the impression that the mountain was somehow alive, breathing, and observing. The papers went on to describe how, if the crystals in that room had such qualities, the group had chosen to go even farther. In the lowest reaches of the earth, what did you anticipate? They had discovered evidence of lower rooms and heard noises that pointed to enormous areas beneath their feet. Therefore, contrary to the greater wisdom of, in order to reach levels that nature had walled off for countless millennia, certain members of the gang had made the decision to dig. Looking up from his writings, Edmund used his flashlight to search the camera until he discovered what he was looking for. There was an obviously artificial aperture on the distant wall, partially obscured by a natural curtain of stalactites. Angles too exact, edges too straight. Unlike the other tunnels, this one was purposefully cut out with tools and resolve, obstructed by unstable rock stacks, as though someone had attempted to block that route quickly without having the time or means to complete a long-term task. With each step, he felt the temperature drop sharply as he moved closer. That region was submerged in a darkness that appeared thicker and more substantial because the crystal's glow did not reach it. As Edmund started to remove the stones that were obstructing the path, more of the aperture that had been brutally carved into the rock became visible. The frigid air that was exiting from there conveyed that. The metallic smell was back, but this time it was stronger, almost oppressive. Edmund hesitated as he eventually made enough room to pass. The last text he had read ended abruptly, as though the author had been interrupted in the middle of a sentence. There was no resolution, no justification for the group's actions, and no explanation for why they had left behind their meticulously arranged equipment and records. Although there was no life in the chamber above, there were no indications of fighting or frantic flight. It seemed as though they had all just chosen to go down and never come back. Edmund lit up the obstructed path. The tool mark was still apparent on the walls of the narrow, unevenly excavated tunnel. He could see that the tunnel sank at a moderate slant and, after a few meters, vanished into darkness. Every survival instinct in his body screamed for him to go away because there was something deeply wrong with that area. Edmund Whitmore, however, had come too far to give up at this point. After adjusting his backpack and checking his flashlight, he went into the tunnel that had been dug out. The area was claustrophobic, which made him stoop as he went. His flashlight appeared to make the walls vibrate. Or maybe his weary eyes were deceiving him. He tried to keep track of the distance he had traveled by mentally counting his steps, but he quickly lost track. The tunnel appeared to go on forever, with every meter being the same, giving him the dizzying impression that he was walking in place while the darkness continued to recycle around him. Then the tunnel suddenly opened onto a space that was beyond Edmund's wildest dreams. It wasn't a chamber like the others, but something far bigger, a depression so big that his flashlight's light could hardly reach the walls on the other side. The floor was flawlessly level, too smooth to have been created by nature, and the ceiling vanished into the utter darkness above. After taking a few tentative steps, Edmund heard his boots echoing in odd directions, as though the room had unattainable acoustics. At the heart of it, there was a structure in the underground hall that brought Edmund to a complete stop. It was an observatory-like structure made of interwoven stone and metal, but its angles and proportions defied standard geometry. Metal arches that glowed coppery in the wavering light were supported by pillars of black stone, like the column he had seen in the upper levels. Additionally, there was a perfectly round circular aperture at the precise middle of this building. Edmund was unable to compute the depths of the carved steps that spiraled down the floor. He approached with a mixture of terror and devotion. There were additional markings on the walls around the hall, but they weren't the same ones he had previously seen. As Edmund walked around the room, he noticed that they were bigger, more ornate, and appeared to convey a visual narrative. The symbols depicted people engaging in a ritualistic activity around buildings that resembled the one in front of him. They depicted something like the earth opening up, coming out or being sealed. The pictures were too unclear to be definitive. Edmund found the portrayals to be frightening. As the visual story developed, the human figures evolved. In the final panels, it was hard to identify where one stopped and another began. Initially, they were distinct and separate, but over time, their forms blended together and became less defined. And the center structure shone with an intensity that the painters had depicted with layers in all of the final panels, making that one thing obvious, and concentric mark layers. He returned his focus to the round aperture. With a mesmerizing regularity, the spiraling steps descended, beckoning him down again. Edmund was aware that his supplies were running low, that his lamp would not last long, and that nobody was aware of his location. He had to turn around, document everything he saw, and return with the right gear and companions out of caution. However, there was a gravitational pull on his will from something there. He started to go down the steps gently, keeping his balance by placing one hand on the spiral's inner wall. Edmund could swear he felt a regular, deep pulse, like a buried heart, originating from this hot, almost feverish stone. Different symbols appeared inscribed on the steps with each full rotation of the spiral. Some he recognized from the books, while others were entirely new. Knowing that he might not have another opportunity to adequately chronicle them, he made an effort to commit them to memory. The drop appeared to last forever, but Edmund finally made it to the bottom. He was stunned by what he discovered there. Compared to the hall above, it was a tiny room, almost personal. Instead of the greenish crystals of the upper chambers, the walls were made of pure crystal. The translucent crystal reflected and refracted his lantern's light in 1,000 various ways, producing a kaleidoscope of shifting shadows. And there was something that shouldn't have been there in the precise middle of this crystalline chamber. It was a mirror. It was an old mirror made of a metallic alloy that Edmund was unaware of, not a contemporary one. The reflecting surface was something darker, almost liquid, rather than silvered glass. There were more of those papers on the crystal floor surrounding the mirror, which was held at a perpendicular angle to the floor by an ornate stand. The manuscripts were written with an almost frenzied urgency, the words racing past one another. Edmund grabbed the closest manuscripts and started reading in the light that flickers. The crew had made a last finding when investigating the crystal's frequencies, according to the writings. They had mastered the art of tuning their awareness to the mountain's vibrations. They had come to the realization that they were not alone as a result. Something else was present. Something that had always existed and was waiting for brains that could see it. This mirror was referred to in the text as a perceptual doorway, rather than a physical one. Anyone who investigated it would see not their own reflection, but rather reflections of possibilities, of courses not taken, of versions of themselves that existed in other choices, in other moments, if the mind was trained and attuned by hours of exposure to superior crystals. The group had developed an obsession with these images, devoting whole days to thinking about the mirror and attempting to map the seemingly endless maze of alternate universes it presented. However, something had started to go awry. The texts started to break up more and more, stating that members of the group started to fail to identify one another, asserting that the person in front of them was a reflection that had crossed over and not the person they claimed to be. Identity-related philosophical debates turned into escalating paranoia. Which version of yourself was the true one, and which had the right to exist in this particular reality, if each decision produced a new one? As Edmund read the last entries, he shivered. The entire tone changed to one of desperation. Please. The author of those last remarks pleaded with anyone discovering that location to destroy the mirror, shut the chambers, and forget about it altogether. However, there were no guidelines for doing this, or an explanation of what had ultimately transpired. The manuscript continued on blank pages when the words abruptly ceased. With shaking hands, Edmund placed the manuscripts away before letting his gaze fully focus on the mirror. Up until that point, he had kept his eyes off its surface, focusing only on, outside of his field of vision. But now that he was by himself in that crystalline chamber with only his lantern's wavering light, he was unable to withstand the impossible object's magnetic attraction. The mirror initially displayed his own image, exhausted and dust-caked, gazing back at him with a mixture of curiosity and fear. But then something started to shift as Edmund got closer. An unseen stone caused the dark surface to ripple like water. His. For a moment, Edmund was confident that the person in the mirror was not moving in the same way as him because the reflection shuddered and warped. He blinked vigorously, blaming the difference on the fatigue and stress of the last several hours. However, the mirror revealed a different image when he opened his eyes once more. He was still there. His stance and facial features were familiar, yet there were minor variations. The Edmund in the mirror had a scar that the real Edmund did not, and he was dressed significantly differently. And there was a look of wisdom in his eyes that seemed to absorb millennia of experience. Edmund flinched involuntarily, but his gaze never left the surface of the mirror. He was not followed by the image. The other Edmund just stood there, observing him intently and unsettlingly. Slowly then, that reflected version lifted a hand and gestured toward something outside the view of the mirror. Edmund was compelled to glance in the suggested direction, but something in. His gut told him that doing so would be a deadly error. The surface of the mirror rippled once more, and several images appeared at once this time. Various Edmunds, each a little different from the others. One wore formal clothing from what appeared to be a more developed era than 1902. Another's face bore the marks of hardships Edmund had never known. They all observed him with the same unnerving feeling, while a third grinned with a delight that appeared different from the actual Edmund. Intensity. When Edmund attempted to get away, his feet appeared to be stuck to the crystal floor. Something more subtle, a gravity drawing his attention toward those unattainable pictures rather than his real body, was holding him. It was both exciting and disturbing to feel his mind expanding, attempting to include all those versions of himself at once. He started to comprehend what had transpired to the group at that point. They had not vanished in the conventional sense. They had become lost in the reflections, their awareness split up into so many different incarnations of themselves that they eventually lost track of which was the original. Now Edmund could sense it occurring to him. His identity was starting to become hazy at the borders, blending with the experiences and recollections of the other Edmunds who were observing him through the mirror. Edmund squeezed his eyelids shut with a great deal of willpower. It felt instantly better to be in the dark, like diving into cool water after. Hours in the blazing heat. Anchoring himself to his body's physical sensations, he inhaled deeply. The hard ground under his boots, the scent of kerosene from his flashlight, and the weight of the rucksack on his shoulders. These were actual, palpable objects that belonged to this particular reality. Edmund recoiled as soon as he was able to move, keeping his eyes firmly away from the mirror. He had to leave the place. He had to detach himself from that. Anything that disregarded every natural law he was aware of. But a question kept coming back to him as he rushed up the spiral steps. How many of the several incarnations of himself in the mirrors had also discovered that location? How many people were confined there? He arrived in the upper hall, panting, his lantern shaking violently in his hand as he gazed at the mirror and saw yet more versions in an unending cycle of reflections. The vast area appeared to be charged with a presence that Edmund had not previously noticed. It was more of an air quality than a physical presence, as though the room itself were observing and evaluating him. Desperate to get to the narrow tunnel that would take him back to the upper chambers, Edmund rushed across the hall. However, he discovered only a solid wall where the tunnel entrance ought to have been. In a desperate attempt to find the opening he had just passed through, Edmund ran his hands over the rocky surface. It couldn't have been that confused. He had entered. A direct line from the main building. There should have been an entrance, but all that was visible was unbroken rock, as though the tunnel had never been there. Cold, visceral panic started to set in. Edmund made himself take deep breaths and think clearly. Maybe his sense of direction had been compromised by the mirror's disorientation. He carefully and methodically went around the hall, lighting every wall segment in an attempt to find any indication of the passage, but he was unsuccessful. The walls were uninterrupted, without any gaps or openings outside the main building, which has a spiral staircase that descends. Edmund sat on the ground, attempting to calm the tremor coursing through his body. It had a rational explanation. There must have been. Maybe there were several entrances in that hall and he just needed to look more closely. Or maybe he was experiencing hallucinations of walls where passageways existed due to prolonged exposure to the crystals. All he had to do was stay composed, save his light, and conduct methodical exploration. Until he managed to get back. But as the hours went by and his lantern gradually ran out, Edmund had to face an unsettling reality. He wasn't just lost. Since he'd looked in the mirror, something had changed fundamentally. The hall looked the same, but it had a different feel to it, as though he had passed through an invisible barrier and was now in a slightly different version of the place he had entered. With renewed interest, he studied the symbols on the walls. Focus, looking for variations that could support his suspicions. Subtle but unmistakable, there it was. There appeared to be one more figure than he had previously seen in the panels depicting the merging human figures. Something that looked like a lantern was carried by a figure. A knot formed in Edmund's stomach. It seemed as though the symbols were constantly changing, adding their own experiences to the age-old story that adorned those walls. He went back to the central structure, looking at it from every perspective. Perhaps, in reaction to his close proximity or his turbulent emotions, the black stone pillars appeared to pulse with a faint inner light. Edmund recalled readings that described how the presence of humans caused crystals to change their frequencies and perceptions. Might the whole building be an amplifier of some sort, intensifying the effects he had felt in the upper chambers? Edmund touched one of the pillars cautiously. The moment his fingers touched the warm stone. Made contact, a sensation passed through his arm. It was a feeling of recognition rather than electricity, as though the building had been waiting for him. His mind was filled with images, fragments of something older rather than his own memories. He observed the team that had constructed that location, working deep within the mountain with an almost fanatical level of resolve. Additionally, he witnessed the moment they found the mirror, which was buried far deeper than any of them could have dug. Edmund realized they hadn't made it. Shocked. All they had done was uncover something that had been there all along, waiting beneath time and rock layers. The mirror existed before the group, possibly even before there were any people in those mountains, and it wasn't the only one, as if they were points in a global network of something Edmund could not adequately describe. The fragments of vision depicted other locations and mountains around the world, each protecting something similar. He swiftly withdrew his hand, causing the connection to break and dizziness. His flashlight flickered, the remaining kerosene being consumed by the flame. Edmund was aware that he might only be a few minutes away from total darkness, and the idea of being there for hours or days without light was too horrifying to consider. He had to decide. There were just two choices. He could keep looking for an exit that didn't appear to be there anymore, using up what little light and energy he had left in a potentially pointless endeavor. Alternatively, he could descend once more, go back to the mirror chamber, and attempt to recognize what was actually taking place. The exit might have been perceptual rather than physical. Maybe his consciousness needed to be realigned with the version of himself that was still present in the outside world. Edmund's beliefs about the nature of reality were completely at odds with this ridiculous notion. However, there was no denying that something unexplainable was taking place. Normal physics didn't seem to apply the same way after he crossed a certain threshold. Edmund considered the group that had preceded him, how they had painstakingly recorded their discoveries until the documentation itself was rendered impossible. He was just starting to see what they had grasped. Edmund made his choice as the lantern threatened to go out at any second. He would descend once more, but this time as a man frantically attempting to return home rather than as a scientist seeking knowledge. He started to go down the spiraling steps, counting each one to keep his thoughts on something concrete and concrete. Edmund allowed himself to synchronize his breathing with the steady pulse that vibrated the stone beneath his feet, going into a state of near meditation. His lantern finally gave out when he arrived at the crystalline chamber, the flame flickering one final time before going out entirely. Edmund, however, found that he was not completely in the dark. The space's fundamental outlines in the mirror were defined by the faint illumination emitted by the crystals on the walls. The mirror was illuminated by its own light, The once dark surface was now glowing a silvery hue that seemed to pulse in time with the structure above. Edmund walked slowly, taking thoughtful, measured steps. He wouldn't turn away this time. He understood that this was his only chance to comprehend what was occurring and possibly even discover a way back. So he would face whatever the item revealed this time. He halted a short distance away from the mirror and made himself stare at its surface. He stumbled at what he saw. There weren't several incarnations of him. This time. It was just one picture, yet it was too complicated to comprehend. In addition to Edmund Whitmore, it was the entire group that had preceded him. It was all of the people who had ever gazed into that mirror, their minds woven together in an impossibly complex web of merged identities. There was something more at the center of it all, something that existed long before anyone ventured into those depths and was not human. At last, Edmund comprehended. The mirror did not display opportunities or different realities. It displayed links. It demonstrated how all of the consciousnesses that had ever been in contact with that location were connected and entwined in ways that went beyond space and time. Edmund was joining that network and becoming a part of something much bigger and older than he could have ever dreamed of just by gazing at it, by really seeing it. His final impression of himself as Edmund Whitmore was one of awe and fear. Then his identity's borders started to blur, and he became a part of something. Anonymous, something that lurked deep within the earth, waiting for every new awareness to come down and discover him. However, a fundamental aspect of Edmund's consciousness, the spark that made him special, resisted being fully absorbed. His fingers slipped, but he managed to hold on to the stability as if he were holding to a rock, while a strong stream attempted to carry him away. Edmund sensed the whispers of other consciousnesses surrounding him, exchanging memories that weren't his, but were now a part of him in languages he shouldn't have understood but did. In 1863, a man named Thomas had come down there to escape a horrible event occurring in the world above. There once was a woman whose name was lost to time, but whose enthusiasm for astronomy inspired her to investigate the Earth's depths with the same fervor that others had for the stars. Every member of the 1847 gang was present, their unique identities now merged into a communal awareness that retained remnants of their initial goals. There were others that dated back to periods that Edmund was unable to comprehend, consciousnesses so old that they hardly had any humanity left. All of them had come there in search of something. They had all discovered the mirror, that unattainable thing that wasn't actually a mirror, but something that the human mind had no better explanation for, as well as knowledge, safety, and answers to problems that the society of their era wasn't ready to ask. Metaphor. Edmund recognized it as a place of confluence because of the shared increased consciousness. The boundaries between people, eras, and even worlds were so blurry that they could be blurred. As he took in all this information, Edmund found it difficult to retain a feeling of self. His name came back to him, and he mentally repeated it like a chant. In 1902, Pittsburgh-born geologist Edmund Whitmore entered this cave in search of rock formations and discovered much more. These served as his real-world coordinates and identity anchors. A part of him clung fiercely to the uniqueness of being himself, even if another part of him longed to give in to the transcendent sensation of being numerous, of existing in so many forms and times at once. The enchantment was ultimately broken by this resistance. Like water in a storm, the mirror's surface rippled furiously as it flickered. Edmund sensed the recoil of the other consciousness, not with animosity but with something that could be reverence or even acknowledgement. After testing his essence, they discovered a substance that was potent enough to resist total dissolution. He would be something that, despite being weaved into the greater design, maintained its own color and texture rather than being merely another thread in the tapestry. Perceptually, rather than physically, the crystalline camera started to move around him. Edmund became aware that he could see several layers of space at once, like sheets of transparent material piled on top of each other. The camera was there in its current state. Other than him and the mirror, it was empty. The camera was there, just as it had been when the crew from 1847 worked there. Tools were strewn around, and voices resounded in fervent conversations about their findings. When Edmund looked at the mirror, he saw the camera in some far-off future, half collapsing with technological apparatus he didn't recognize. There were even more bizarre layers versions of the camera that appeared to exist in other geometries, with the walls curving at angles that were painful for him to follow. In between, with all of these layers, Edmund started to envisage routes through overlapping perceptions, not actual tunnels that would allow him to travel between the various realities that came together at that particular moment. At last, he realized how the bunch had vanished. They had not been destroyed or killed. Each member finally discovered a version of reality that more closely matched who they had become as a result of their exposure to the mirror. They had simply chosen different routes. Edmund could follow suit. He may select any of those layers and follow it, ending up somewhere else, at a different period, or even in a different version of himself. The temptation was overwhelming. There was a part of him that imagined himself as a reputable academic, imparting his findings to enthusiastic students. In another, he lived in seclusion in the mountains and protected the location's secret like a priceless possession. In one instance, he had never entered the cave and was leading an entirely different life. and ignorant of everything. Which one, though, was genuine? Which Edmund was the actual one? The response was one of direct comprehension rather than words. None was more true than the others. They were all equally real. Reality was a network of possibilities with endless branches rather than a single line, and consciousness was what moved between them, deciding which course to take at any given time. Because the paths were so identical that the transitions were undetectable, the majority of individuals never understood these choices. However, the distinctions were magnified to the point of visibility at that point of confluence. Edmund shut his eyes, shutting out the layers of overlapping images that were threatening to take over his thoughts. He had to make a decision, but not at random. He had to find his way back to the Edmund who had down there. The particular Edmund who still had a life waiting in the world above, who had notes and records at his hotel, and who had people who would eventually come looking for him when he failed to return. That was the route he desired because it was the only one he felt was genuinely his, not because it was more real than the others. He extended his hand once more, this time to the space between himself and the mirror's reflecting surface rather than the mirror itself. Something that shouldn't have been there was touched by his fingers, a texture that was both hot and cold, solid and fluid at the same time. Edmund recognized that the substance itself was what kept the layers apart, and instead of following an existing route, he could forge his own if he could learn to shape it. In response to his intention, the crystals on the wall started to glow more brightly. Edmund sensed that the mountain itself was the source of the energy coursing through him, not his own life force, or even from every awareness that had been a part of that network over the ages. They were assisting him, acknowledging his commitment to preserving his uniqueness while also taking part in the bigger picture. Edmund started to weave a path with focused effort. He saw the winding stairs, the small passageway, the chamber with the greenish crystals, each area he had traveled through on his descent. However, he was caught in this plane of reality and was unable to visualize them. When he was still tightly bound to his own particular timeline, he pictured things as they were when he first passed through them. His intention caused the mirror to react. Instead of reflections, its surface started to display projections images of the locations Edmund was attempting to reach. And as he sharpened his concentration, the pictures grew more than visual. He experienced those locations as though he were in both the crystal chamber and those other areas at the same time. His awareness sharpened like a thread stretched to its limit, and he felt as though he was being stretched between several points. Then something gave way. It opened like a closed door, finally moving on its hinges, yet it didn't break. Edmund sensed himself being drawn through the levels of reality he had learned to navigate, not literally, but in every other way imaginable. Perceive. You were also innumerable, and the movement was both immediate and forever lengthy, taking a moment. Edmund was back in the room of greenish crystals when the feeling of movement finally stopped. However, something had changed. He was unique. In the depths, he saw that he still held pieces of the experience he had gone through. Memories that were not quite his own, insights that went beyond what one person should be able to comprehend. It seemed as though he had. He was squashed back to his initial size after expanding to occupy a greater area. But now that all those memories had been folded and kept inside of him, he stared at his hands, and they trembled not out of terror, but rather out of what might be described as reverent admiration. He had seen something that went against every framework science has developed to describe the cosmos. He now had to make a decision about what to do with this information. He could attempt to record it in order to translate something that fundamentally opposed such a translation. Alternatively, he may maintain the secrecy and allow that location to stay concealed in the mountain's interior, shielded by its own impossibility. Edmund moved carefully around the room, brushing against the walls where the symbols were still dimly glowing. He could now read them with the enlarged comprehension he had regained, not with his eyes. In a traditional sense, the symbols weren't a language. They served as maps and navigational aids for the layers of reality that came together there. Every sign served as a directive, caution, a message from the past to assist the future. He was particularly interested in one sign. The surrounding stone was less worn by time, and it looked more modern than the others. It was immediately recognized by Edmund as one of the symbols he had seen in the 1847 group's later papers. It was both a promise and a warning. It was an obvious warning. One ran the risk of losing their feeling of identity if they went too far down or stared too intently into the mirror. All in all, the promise, however, was just as obvious. A better comprehension of the nature of existence will always be carried by those who are able to retain their essence throughout union. It was time to climb, Edmund realized. He found he didn't need his lamp, so he turned it off. Now that he was there, the crystals reacted to his presence differently than they had in the past. They lit up as he got closer and dimmed when he was gone, forming a line of light that instinctively led him to the exit. The mountain itself seemed to recognize. Said he was now assisting him in returning to the outside world after passing some sort of test. It was the proper location for the tube that would take him back to the upper room. Although Edmund knew he had previously looked in vain, he wasn't shocked to locate it. He understood that it wasn't that the tunnel hadn't existed previously. He hadn't been in the proper stratum of reality to notice it, that's why. Now that he knew how to move between the layers, he could just decide to be in the one where. The exit was reachable. Edmund considered the group that had preceded him as he ascended. Now he knew why his manuscripts ended so suddenly. It was because they had reached a point when writing was no longer logical, not because something horrible had happened. How could an experience that fully transcended the linear perspective of time and space be put into words? How could one describe the unification of awareness to someone who had never experienced it? Be both a part of something unimaginably bigger and oneself at the same time? He arrived at the room with the black stone column in the middle, where he had discovered the first manuscripts. Even if the markings on the wall still had a secret meaning, the room appeared smaller and more ordinary. Edmund picked up his notebook, the one in which he had painstakingly recorded his early findings, and turned the pages. His notes, which were really cursory observations that hardly touched the surface of what that location was like, now seemed juvenile. Was, in fact. His hands stopped on the blank page as he thought for a moment about adding fresh entries, attempting to capture something of what he had experienced. The phrases that sprung to me were insufficient, simplistic, and distorted rather than enlightening the truth. Maybe it was preferable to keep the riddle unsolved so that each person who fell to those depths may follow their own path of discovery, free from the faulty interpretations of those who came before them. Edmund closed the journal and carried on with his. Climb. With every meter that went by, the air became fresher, and he could sense the surface's close vicinity by a shift in the pressure in his ears. A part of him yearned for the sunshine and the open sky of the outside world, but another part, the one that had been changed by the experience in the depths, was sad to be departing. It was like letting go of a piece of himself, or maybe more accurately, letting go of the knowledge that the self was far larger and more intricate than he had ever thought of. Even though it was late afternoon and the sun had already set, the daylight streaming from the cave mouth felt blinding when he finally arrived. After spending so many hours in the dark, Edmund's eyes took some time to adjust, and he blinked constantly. He came out of the cave mouth and took a long breath of the clean mountain air, feeling the chilly wind against his sweaty, dust-covered face. In front of him was the Valley of Nothingness, with the Appalachian Mountains standing out against the dusk sky. Everything appeared to be just as it had been upon his descent, as though he spent an eternity in the depths and the outside world had stopped. However, Edmund was aware that he was no longer the same person who had gone into that cave. He now carried understandings that went beyond his formal education, memories that were not his own, and a persistent sense that reality was far more pliable and fluid than the science of his day was willing to acknowledge. His movements were mechanical as he started back down the path that had brought him there. Everything he had gone through was still being processed by his thoughts. Edmund was aware that in the upcoming hours and days, he would have to make tough choices. Should he inform the scientific authorities of his discovery? And should he lead others there so they would share in what he had gone through? Or should he close the entrance, discard his notes and maps, and allow the cave to revert to the forgotten state from which he had saved it? There were implications to each choice that he could not fathom. If he disclosed the existence of the mirror and the subterranean chambers, he would draw attention that would turn that hallowed location into a spectacle, with throngs of people arriving unprepared or unaware of what they would discover. However, if he said nothing, he would be depriving mankind of information that may drastically change how it perceives reality, awareness, and the basis of human existence. Edmund spent hours strolling through the thick woodland, following his instincts rather than his mental recollection of the route. It was very dark when, at last, he saw the dim lights of the little settlement where he had set up his base camp. After spending so much time underground, the wooden homes seemed surreal, like theatrical sets built to give the impression of civilization amid the untamed expanse of the mountains. When he reached the inn where he had reserved a room, he descended the stairs in silence, avoiding the main hall where several residents were drinking and having hushed conversations. Edmund wasn't prepared for everyday human contact. He continues to, carried that sense of multiplicity, of being more than a single person, on the periphery of his awareness. To reintegrate, to learn to inhabit the limited perspective of a single mind in a single body, he required time alone. Edmund sat at the little wooden table beside the window in his room and lit a lamp. He could see the mountain's sharp shapes against the starry sky through the dusty glass. He pondered that it was concealed beneath time and rock layers down there. As the world above continued to be unaware of its existence, the mirror continued to wait, that impossibly impossible fusion of consciousness and reality, pulsing silently in the darkness. Edmund flipped through the blank pages of his notebook and thought. He just remained there for a long time, pen hovering over the page, searching for the first words that could start to describe what he had experienced. However, every phrase he conjured up in his head seemed fictitious, simplistic, and unable to convey the core of his experiences. How could he explain the sensation of being both himself and innumerable other people at the same time? How was he going to explain that he had come into contact with something that existed outside of time? At last, he started writing something more akin to poetry rather than a scientific narrative. Words that pointed toward reality without trying to cage it in strict definitions, that indicated rather than defined. He described the passage through the halls and the symbols that were less than words and more than ornamentation. He wrote about the 1847 team and its endeavors to chart the unattainable. He wrote about the network of consciousnesses he had discovered entwined in the depths and about the mirror that wasn't actually a mirror. However, Edmund became aware that he was producing something hazardous as he wrote. Even though his words were well crafted, they were still a map, and explorers were drawn to maps. Others would undoubtedly follow if he published it and shared even bits of what he had found. Some would reverently pursue knowledge and take care. Some, Edmund thought, would come with purposes he couldn't even fully comprehend, while others would come out of morbid curiosity or a need to investigate the sensational. He recalled the caution he had read in the earlier manuscripts, "Do not descend any more." He realized now that it was a warning about existential risk rather than bodily danger. The risk of never being the same person again was going down to the mirror. It was facing facts about reality and consciousness that most people were not prepared to face. Ready for processing. Edmund was aware that he had either been fortunate or perhaps had a certain trait that had shielded him from total disintegration, but he had managed to endure the ordeal while retaining his personality. How many others would be as resilient? How many would be lost, not in the sense of passing away, but in the sense of being broken apart into so many different versions of themselves that they would never be able to put the pieces back together? Edmund immediately closed the journal, choosing. He refused to release any content. No one would be led there by him. He would allow the cave, shielded by its own darkness, to revert to its natural state of oblivion. Even so, there was a part of him that wondered if he had the right to make that decision. His acquired expertise was not entirely his own. Even if it was painful and radically changed how people perceived their own lives, it was a part of something far bigger, an insight that maybe humanity needed. Who was he to make that decision? Should the entire species continue to be unaware of such fundamental realities? Edmund stayed up all night arguing with himself, weighing and reevaluating every aspect of the problem. By morning, his hands were shaking from fatigue, and he had black circles under his eyes. However, he had also come to a decision. He would record all he could recall, but he wouldn't release it right away. Rather, he would seal the papers and set instructions that they could only be opened decades later. Future, when people could be better equipped to handle such discoveries. Edmund admitted that it was a compromise, and likely a flawed one, but it was the best he could do with what little knowledge he still had. Over the course of the following few days, he would painstakingly record everything, make diagrams of the symbols he had observed, and map the chambers as best he could recall. However, the records would be carefully stored, shielded from prying eyes until the time came, suitable to make them public. After a long night of sitting, Edmund got up from his chair and went to the window, his muscles groaning. The far-off summits were painted in shades of crimson and gold as the sun rose over the mountains. The cave was somewhere out there, concealed beneath one of those rocky peaks. The entwined consciousnesses around the mirror remained in their eternal vigil, protecting secrets that defied all human certainties, while the mirror itself continued to reflect its impossibilities in the darkness. He questioned whether he would. Never come back. A part of him wanted to descend once more in order to go deeper and attempt to comprehend the essence of what he had touched. However, there was another part that recognized it would be risky, the part that still struggled to stay cohesive as an individual. It would be more difficult to get back each time he dropped. The bounds of his own identity would become increasingly brittle with each exposure to the mirror and the forces that were coming together at that moment. Edmund ate breakfast by himself in his room, continuing to stay away from other individuals. In order to conceal the enormity he suddenly felt inside himself, he had to relearn how to communicate regularly. He had questions he wasn't ready to answer, but he couldn't let what he had gone through show. He had to retrain himself to be merely Edmund Whitmore, a regular geologist investigating fascinating rock formations, rather than Edmund Whitmore, who had experienced the diversity of entwined lives and returned changed. Over the next few days, Edmund developed a pattern. Throughout the day, he investigated different mountain regions, gathering common rock samples and taking traditional geological notes. He admitted that it was a show, a front to keep up appearances, but it was also essential. In order to practice being himself once more, he needed to ground himself in reality. He labored on the classified documents at night while confined to his chamber, transferring memories and insights onto pages that would remain hidden for decades. The documenting process was both difficult and cathartic at the same time. Each time I felt that words were inadequate when I attempted to express what I had gone through. It was like attempting to depict a whole symphony with just 3 notes, or painting a sunset with only gray. The simultaneous and multifaceted character of what I had seen was beyond the scope of words, which were such limiting linear tools. Edmund continued, nevertheless. He wrote because the act of writing comforted him, not because he anticipated that his future publications would accurately convey the facts. Procedure. Every word he wrote contributed a stone to the conceptual framework he was attempting to construct for himself. And maybe, just maybe, in the far future, someone might read those texts and discover something helpful among the flawed translations. Edmund felt stable enough to engage with people normally a week after emerging from the cave. After dining with the inhabitants in the inn's lounge, he was asked courteous questions about his travels, provided evasive responses regarding intriguing geological samples and rock formations. Edmund had a sense of guilty relief that no one seemed to suspect that he had made a remarkable discovery. Edmund was frozen in place when one of the elder men, a hunter who had spent his entire life in those mountains, quietly stated something. The speaker was discussing how the indigenous people who had lived in the area before to European colonization had legends about hallowed locations buried deep within the ground, locations where. And they claimed that it was possible to glimpse other planets and communicate with ancestors. The colonists had written off the tales as superstition, but the hunter thought there might be some truth to them. Edmund listened intently as the man went on to explain how some explorers have reported odd encounters in some of the area's caves over the years. There were hints, tidbits, and indications that something strange was happening beneath those mountains, but nothing as dramatic as what Edmund had experienced. The hunter had his doubts, but most people wrote off such reports as hallucinations brought on by natural gases or an overworked imagination. A few days later, Edmund departed the community with his sealed notebooks and the conviction that certain things were too great to tell right now. Although he was never the same man who had left, he returned to his life in Pittsburgh. Edmund would close his eyes and sense that slight connection to something on calm nights when the city slept all around him. Hidden, deep in the mountains, it is huge and timeless. Years went by. Edmund carried on with his career as a geologist, writing articles about typical rock formations, teaching at universities on occasion, and leading what appeared to be an ordinary life to outsiders. However, many who knew him well saw a change in him, a detached look in his eyes, as though he was constantly paying attention to something that nobody else could see. He never discussed the discovery he made in the cave in the valley of forgetfulness. The papers he had penned were kept hidden and sealed with explicit guidelines stating that they may only be accessed under specified circumstances. Edmund was unsure if those pages would someday be discovered or if they would just fade away with time, becoming dust like so many other lost secrets. It didn't really matter. The experience's real worth came from having gone through it, not from discussing it. Even though he was never able to properly express it, he carried that broadened awareness with him. Occasionally, nightmares that Edmund would go back to those subterranean rooms. Upon descending the spiral steps once more, he would see all those entwined consciousnesses staring back at him from the mirror that shone in the darkness. Every time he woke up, there was a moment of uncertainty as to whether Edmund had dreamed of the mirror or if one of the many consciousnesses in the mirror was dreaming of being Edmund. To this day, the cave is still concealed in a secluded Appalachian valley. Decades of overgrowth and natural erosion have concealed its entrances. Maybe it will ultimately be discovered by another adventurer. Go down to the bottom of it and touch what Edmund touched. Or maybe it will always be sealed. Only the silent rock and unrelenting time can protect its secrets. Certain doors cannot be fully closed once they are open. However, some could have been better off never being opened in the first place. The epithet Valley of Oblivion is aptly applied. A location where mysteries lurk in the shadows and stories are forgotten. Old mountains. Additionally, some people claim that they can hear echoes of something that isn't quite sound during particularly quiet nights when the wind blows through the rocky peaks in a particular way. This is because it resonates not in the ears but directly in the awareness of those who are sensitive enough to experience it. To the end of his life, Edmund Whitmore kept his secret. A tale that was both too great and too modest to convey the breadth of its true significance. And maybe that's how things ought to be. Certain facts that are exclusive to in the forgotten depths of the earth, the borders of language, indicated but never fully exposed, eagerly await those who are bold or stupid enough to seek them out. For more tales that push the limits of what is known and what is not, please like and subscribe to the channel if you liked this voyage through the shadows and mysteries concealed in the depths. Please share your thoughts about this unsettling story, and unless the following tale challenges your understanding of what is,